Hello and welcome back to IGB100, the practical tutorial series. This is week 5 and this week we'll be starting work on the FPS game. Now you don't need to make this a typical FPS game. You can, for example, make a walking simulator or a farming game or even something like a driving game if you so choose to. This lesson and future ones will, however, focus a bit more on the artistic side of Unity, something that we haven't really been jumping into too much in the first few videos. And this lesson in particular, we'll introduce to you some of the Unity terrain tools. We're also going to go outside of Unity and model something in a separate program, in this case Blender, so that we have something that we can actually import into Unity and some of the settings that may be required there so that that process is a little bit smoother. We'll also potentially go into a really basic retexturing tutorial with Photoshop just to help people who maybe aren't happy with textures within Unity. But don't worry, if you are a programmer, there'll still be plenty of scripting to come too, some of which will be quite advanced as we deal with weapon mechanics and AI. So that will potentially be the next lesson after this one. So to get started with this game, first you'll need to download the package off Blackboard in the same way that you did for the shmup game in week 2. So this will be a week 5 package available off Blackboard in the appropriate directory. Now what you'll notice upon opening this is that there isn't a great deal of actual content in the scene. We're going to set that up. What you will notice, however, is that some of the assets, like the shmup package, are already there for you. In this case, we have a little bit of audio, we have some different model files, some of the scripts that we had in the previous package that we already made have carried over in a similar sense. We're not going to write them from scratch again. But most importantly, something that we could change now just so this looks a little bit better is adding a skybox. So in the previous package we did that for you. It's not a difficult operation at all. Just go to Window, Lighting, and I believe we have downloaded a skybox for you. If I just type in sky, we've currently got the default selected. If you select sky 5x2, you will get a much more pleasant looking one here. So skyboxes are just textures in a cubic environment set up to basically be able to be viewed from internal, like an internal camera that looks through them. You can actually download a few more of them from the asset store if you are so inclined. So once your package is ready to go, we first want to add to this by introducing you to the Unity Terrain tool. So up until now we've just been interacting with basic game objects to, I guess you could say, prototype our game world if you have been experimenting with that a bit. And they're your usual cube, plane, sphere, basic geometric tools available to you. They're great, again, for prototyping, but if you do want something slightly more organic, something that looks a little bit more natural, we're going to have to go with something slightly more complex. And in this case, we're going to introduce you to the Terrain game object. So select one of those from the game object, 3D object menu. And what that'll do is drop this huge white plane within your world. Now you may want to switch this to perspective view just so you can actually see the size of this thing. It's pretty large. So what we may do, first of all, is just rescale it. Instead of it being 500 on the width and length, let's make that 125 for both. So that'll make it a little bit smaller. But what we also will do is recenter this thing by putting it at, what's half of that, negative 62.5 on the X and on the Z. So that should put it roughly where that camera was, which was almost on the origin, so that's good enough. Cool. Now, just so that we can distinguish between what we're looking at, because looking at a big plane of white is a little bit hard to, well, tell where the hell we are with respect to the horizon, let's introduce you straight away to the Paint tool. Now, by default, there is no Paint terrain selected, so you'll need to, first of all, select the Paint tool and click on Edit Textures. So if you add a texture, we will go to the albedo setting, and we should have some basic grass textures ready to go for you. So not the actual grass where there's a picture of a grass sprite. Pick the grass hill texture and press add. And that should add a nice green texture throughout your environment. Now that's typically good enough, but what you can do with the paint tool is actually add more textures to it, such as, I think we had, if I just type that in, that might get the rest. If you type in albedo, we can get the hill, the rocky, and the sand. So I think the ones that I want here are maybe rocky, so we'll add that one, and we'll also add the sand one. So if I just type in sand, grab that one as well. This gives us a few different types, but at its base it will be the grass texture that we first selected. So if I did just want to add a little bit of a more rocky texture to this terrain, I could adjust some of these settings. You may just have to experiment with what works for you, and you could start painting. So this may need to be a little bit stronger. But yeah, you could spend a good deal of time here getting these terrain tools looking like something that would be realistic. This currently isn't looking too flash, so I might just bring it back a little bit. But take some time to muck around with the paint tools to develop a bit of a terrain setting that, at least color-wise, looks good for you. Okay, so once you're happy with painting it, all I did was just a rough kind of splatter of paint everywhere using the various textures that I had selected. Not going to pay too much attention to it. Let's deal with actually morphing this terrain a little bit to look something resembling an arena. So within the FPS game that I'll be setting up, at least, I'm going to have the player within the middle of an arena-like environment where there is some upraised platforms or hills that the player can't get around or over. So they're enclosed in this environment. You could do that, or you could set it up the way that you want if you have a different kind of first-person shooter game set in mind. However, what we need to do to make any of this terrain happen is look at the tool on the far left, which is the raise or lower terrain. So what we can do here is select the brush size and opacity settings that we want. In this case I might go for quite large, and just to make this that kind of arena-like environment, I'm just going to lightly touch around the circumference of this terrain tool to get a slightly raised terrain setting. Something else you may want to look at regarding the terrain tool is if you've made a bit of a blunder like I have, making some really weird looking terrain, maybe because your opacity setting was set a bit too high. The tool to the right of the raise or lower is what's called paint height. Now what this allows you to do is actually set a height by, just to demonstrate, I'll set it to something quite low like 5, which means that when you start painting now everything will be raised to that level. Now that can give you some nice level terrain, or allow you to kind of level terrain to, or at least not past, a certain height. So it gives you a little bit more control on what you can do, and is often useful for, I guess, normalizing terrain to an extent. So once you're done with that, the final thing we'll get you to do is just increase your brush size to something rather large, but make it its opacity kind of low, maybe 5, and just drop a couple of light hills within the center of this arena setting that kind of act as light terrain within the environment itself. Not too many of these, because we are going to eventually make use of them to a slight degree. Just a couple of raised minor hills within the setting. So once you're happy with that, one other thing that we can add is a little bit of flora to the environment. Now we won't really focus too much on this because you can get very carried away and that's not the point of what we're trying to make here. But if you did want to put a few trees in, select the tree tool. We will need to edit trees to add one. There should be a basic, I think we added a palm tree. Basic palm tree that's within Unity's stock assets. So we can add that. Let's make that brush size just a little bit smaller. I kind of just want to add individual palm trees at this point, mainly because I know that this tree is a little bit big. Yeah. So, maybe drop those tree settings to something slightly lower and just drop a few palm trees in. Now you can set this to have random height differentiation. I don't really care too much about what they're looking like at this point, but yeah, this is kind of looking like a little bit of like an oasis desert setting, which is fine. We can live with that. In addition to trees, there's also grass. If you click the tool on the right, we can add some minor shrubbery to the terrain, and this is usually in the form of two-dimensional sprites, so they're not actually three-dimensional objects that you would add using this tool. Same way, we can add a grass texture. I think looking at the grass stuff that we had before, we will pick maybe something a little bit lighter. That one should be fine. And again, don't go too nuts with this, because you can really hurt the performance of your game if you paint incredibly large patches of grass from far away. So let's just see what this is going to look like. Whoa. See, even that is a little bit too complex for what I want. So I might make the brush size big, but the opacity really low. That's looking about right. So just give your terrain a little bit of grass. Again, this isn't really the focus of what we are trying to do this lesson. This is just to introduce you to the tools. If you feel you want to muck around with this a little bit more in your own time, please feel free. And that's basically it regarding Unity's terrain tool. We're not really going to go into it in too much more detail than that. You can add more details to this, paint it a bit more professionally if you are an artist, but generally speaking this will do for the kind of environment that we have planned. Now, if you did want to explore your game world at this point, we can jump ahead and introduce you to the FPS character controller. So, within the actual project assets folder, we have given you a character controller. We will drop that in now, and that should allow you to actually start moving around the environment if you needed to. What you may need to do first, however, is turn off this camera. So the FPS controller by default has a camera attached to it. If we don't want the scenes to get confused, let's turn off this camera. We will still be using it, so don't delete it, which means when you start playing with the character controller, you can start moving around your environment in an FPS fashion. So the next half of this video, we're actually going to be going outside of Unity for a little bit and walking into a modeling program. Now, some of you may be saying, well, I'm a programmer, I don't care about the modeling side of things. The thing is, you really should, because a free modeling tool, at least a free modeling tool like Blender, for instance, is a great way for you to prototype certain aspects of your game, whether they be basic animations, whether they just be general shapes that have the layout of your environment that your modelers maybe haven't given to you yet. You as a programmer, but especially as a modeler, can go ahead and prototype basic geometry that you can drop into your level. Now we're going to simulate this by making a house in Blender. So, if you just close some of these down and open up Blender, Now, this isn't going to be a tutorial about how to use Blender at all. Blender has its own very complex controls and systems in place that an experienced modeler may be quite at home with, but for someone who's never used this before, we certainly don't expect you to use this to any professional degree. So, to get you started, all we're going to do is make a house. To do this, we're going to use just two tools. That's going to be called extruding and merging. By default, when you open up Blender, you're given a basic cube. If you just select this cube, but don't move it like I did, and hold the middle mouse button, you can move around this cube. If you press Tab, you will enter what's called Edit Mode, which will allow you to individually select the vertices of this cube. If you press A, you will deselect them all. If you press A again, you'll select them. What we want to do is do two extrusions of some of these vertices. The first one is just going to be to grab these four vertices by holding Control and highlighting them, and then pressing E. Now E will allow you to extrude the vertices. So you make more, you kind of clone them and push them down the axes that they're facing. Now I'm doing this snap extrusion technique by holding Control at the same time. So E and then Control will allow you to do this, otherwise you'll have free reign of the control. But I want something with slightly more precision, so I'm going to do it like this, and when I'm happy, I'm going to click. That's a basic 3D modeling extrusion. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do to expand this house a little bit more is make an extrusion on the top. So just grabbing the top, 6 vertices, I'm then going to press E again and push it up one level. Not two, just one. Whoop. Yeah, don't do that. I will, however, just recenter this entire model by selecting all the vertices and moving it roughly back onto the point of origin. Now there are some techniques to make this slightly more precise. I believe they are in one of the settings here, or is it mesh snap settings, but we're not too fast about that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going to do something wrong while I'm recording this. So moving those vertices back roughly to the point of origin, just deselect them all, selecting just the top two. I now want you to press M on your keyboard, or I believe that might be Alt M. So Alt M, and we want to merge this at the center. Cool. So let's do that again for the other 2 or 4 vertices. Alt M at center. Cool. So that is the basic house that we're going to use. If you by any chance are a actual 3D modeler, you know how to do this a lot better than I do, go nuts. If you aren't, if you are a programmer and are maybe curious, play around, see what you can do just with extrusion and merging. You can come up with some pretty complex geometry just using those tools. However, for the purposes of this model, this is all that we care about. So, if you press Tab and exit Edit Mode, you will walk back into Object Mode, and we're going to export this. To do this, we first need to get rid of a couple of objects attached to this default Blender object, such as the lamp in the hierarchy up here. We're going to get rid of that. So right click on that and select delete, and we're also going to get rid of the camera. So we don't care about any of those objects within our scene. Exporting this, however, is interesting because the coordinate system that Blender uses is slightly different from the one that Unity uses. Now, if you go back into Unity, you'll notice that just looking at this object here, we can see that the y-axis is the one pointing up, and it's not too clear here, but the z-axis is what's called the forward vector of an object. So y goes up and z goes forward. So in Blender we want to export along those settings. So if you go to File, Export, and we're going to export this as an FBX. That's a file type that Unity is quite compatible with. It's small, compact, it has good performance settings within Unity. So let's export that as an FBX. And specifically, somewhere in the Blender UI, you will find a couple of settings. The first one being forward. This one is saying negative Z. We want positive Z. And it's also saying up. And we, I believe, actually do just want to set that to Y up. So that's already good. I think I may have set this beforehand. However, if yours is not set to that, set it to that. And most importantly, click this, I'm not sure why it says experimental there, apply transform setting there. So make sure you have those settings in place before you export, otherwise none of this will matter correctly. Let's export this to somewhere useful. I'm just going to jump it on the desktop. I might rename this to house, barely a house, but it'll do, and export. And if you've done it correctly, if you go to your directory in question, there's my FBX file. So what I'm going to do to move this FBX file is actually just grab it and push it through to the correct directory directly through Unity. So I'm just going to drop it into my models directory. And what you can see is our house is pretty well aligned. That's great. What I can do now, I can drop that straight in and it should be ready to go. As you can see, it's already casting a shadow, which is great. We may need to configure the collider settings later. And the easiest way to do that is actually just to give this object a mesh collider. Use the mesh itself, because it's a pretty simple mesh, as the actual collider for this object. So when you play the game now, that house, which will probably make it a little bit bigger as well, is something that we actually can't pass through. Now this is important because the next step that we're going to perform within this game is actually adding what's called a navigation mesh. And without the objects in question having some kind of collider, such as these trees, which don't really collide too well, but there is something there, the navigation mesh won't know that there's an object there. So we need objects like these to have a collider attached. So it's a pretty simple process. However, that's next week's work. We'll get to that in, well, next week. Final thing that we're going to do today, once you've moved that house and maybe made it just a little bit bigger, I made it 2 on each, well, not 12, but 2 on each axis, wires, is just a little trick to, I guess, show you how to quickly configure textures that are already existing in your game. Now, typically, when you set up a 3D model like a house, you would UV texture map the thing straight away, just to give it some basic textures. That's not so straightforward a process, to the extent where showing you how to do that here is going to take a little bit too much time. For the people who know 3D modeling already, I'm pretty sure you'll know how to do that pretty easily, but for everyone else who has having to deal with textures, changing them can be an absolute nightmare. So just using our attack bot model as an example here, and we will rescale that. Let's maybe do that now to make it 5-ish, just so we have something that's a little bit bigger to look at. If, for example, we didn't want to have the red on this red, we wanted it to be green, I don't know, maybe you do. We can simply change the color of the actual textures that it's attached to. So, in this case, I want to adjust this particular texture, the body. what we can do is, just to quickly get to it, we can show that in Explorer, go to the textures file, and conveniently some of these are already set up as PSDs in Photoshop, but they will have come from other places such as JPEGs or PNGs. Either way, whether they exist as PSDs, whether they originally exist as JPEGs, open them up in a program like Photoshop, and from this point really you do whatever you need to do. In this case, if I want to make this green, I can, for example, either change the hue or saturation of it. So that's actually affecting this layer. So what I might do is just select all the layers that have something red on them, and basically, first of all, just merge them together. Typically you won't have to do this if you're using a JPEG already. And from that point, adjust the saturation as a whole. I can make that, for example, green. Looks like I didn't grab all the layers, that's okay. Let's make that green. Go back to Unity and we can see that the color of our object has changed slightly. So you'll need to do that for the guns and the wheels, and looks like the axle as well. Usually most models don't have this many material textures attached to them, but again, this is just a simple way to show you if you do need to recolor something. It's a very simple process. Just open Photoshop or equivalent retexturing tool and just change the colors. Okay, so that's it for this week. We will be walking into scripting territory again next week. Again, this tutorial, this practical video has just been more on the art side of things. We will continue the art side of things a little bit more by talking about Unity's animation system, particularly the mechanism animation system, but that won't be until the game after this one. So, until next week.